The Denver Broncos offseason is just beginning, and they've lost a key executive in the front office, and they've already lost a young assistant coach. How might that benefit the Broncos going into 2025? We'll break that down and much more here on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Broncos Country, what's happening? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where you know it is your team every day. We appreciate you so much. Thanks to all the everydayers out there in Broncos Country. Thanks to the first listeners for making us a big part of your day every single day throughout the entire offseason, because as you know, for the true fan, there is never an offseason. For all your Broncos news, content, coverage, analysis, and more, Locked On Broncos is the place to be all year long. I'm Cody Roark, Broncos credentialed beat reporter for Mile High Sports, joined as always by longtime site expert, predominantlyorange.com, Sayre Bedinger. And look, Broncos Country, we got a lot to break down this week as the final game of the NFL season in 2024 is looming in a couple of weeks. We know the Super Bowl matchup that is going to be set, but we'll also talk about really on today's show how the Broncos need to address the tight end position in 2025. We'll then discuss how bad the production was from that room in 2024 and why that was an issue in terms of offensive inefficiency at times this season. But we're going to kick things off with some big news here for the Broncos. They lost two members of their organization over the weekend, one executive and one young assistant coach. A lot to break down on today's episode of the show, brought to you by our friends over there at FanDuel. And Super Bowl 59 is here, and there's no better way to make every play more exciting than with FanDuel Sportsbook. New customers can bet just $5, and if you win, you'll score $200 in bonus bets. Download the app or head to FanDuel.com to get started. Sayre, busy weekend for the Broncos and certainly for the organization and for Sean Payton. They'll have to make some changes and look to either bring in somebody externally or hire from within to fill two vacancies right now on the staff. Let's start off with the biggest one. Darren Mougey, as we talked about as well, finally lands that GM job with the New York Jets.
Yeah, good for Darren Mougey, obviously getting a job after working for over a decade with the Denver Broncos. Mougey's been part of a number of different eras of Denver Broncos football, hasn't he? I mean, dating back to the Peyton Manning era, obviously, and early in his time there. So I kind of feel like, Cody, my take on this is that Mougey is sort of the perfect candidate for the New York Jets because they just so happen to be going through a situation where an older quarterback is potentially, he's not going to be riding off into the sunset like Peyton Manning, but he's going to an organization where there's going to be a quarterback situation happening in the very near future. What has he been through with the Denver Broncos? He's been through some quarterback situations, right? He's seen what not to do and definitely what to do when it comes to bringing in Peyton Manning, when it comes to the drafting of Bo Nix and finding the right coach and quarterback combination. So I think he's in a good spot there with New York. I didn't really like that situation on paper for anybody, whether it was coach or GM, but I like Darren Mougey going there because of what he was able to do in Denver over the last decade plus, seeing the success of a veteran quarterback who was kind of a, cast away by his previous franchise, and then going through the quarterback carousel. Hopefully what he learned in Denver will help him establish something much, much more quickly with the New York Jets.
I mean, you look at the John Elway GM tree now, it's kind of growing there. Darren Mougey being one of them, John Spytek, who's now landing with the Las Vegas Raiders as their general manager, and obviously Adam Peters, getting to where he's at, as well. But, for Mougey, and this is it, because look, if you're a Jets fan that's stumbling upon this as we talk about this, Mougey, I think, is the right build, the right criteria for what you want in terms of a first-time general manager, because he's done the work. Like, for George Payton for a very, very long time was a scout. He came into the NFL and was a scout, cut his teeth as a scout, and then he worked his way up, obviously, being the right hand to Rick Spielman in Minnesota when he was there. But the thing that I also look at it as well is he's a guy who started off as an intern and he's earned his role. He has climbed his way up the ladder from 2012 all the way till now, like scouting intern in 2012, now a GM here in 2025. So he's got the experience. And as you mentioned, Sayre, I think, being behind guys like John Elway, George Payton, like you see a lot in that role where you're not necessarily making decisions, but, you have an idea on how to identify players. You can learn from those guys in those situations. My only plea, and I want to see Darren Mougey have so much success here. My only plea is the Jets ownership. Stay out of his way. Let him do his job. That's the problem with anybody that goes to New York. That dang ownership group refuses to get out of the way of the people that actually know about football and that know about what it takes to build a team. There's a level of patience that's required, and Mougey and the Jets are going to need it. I think they have a good young roster, but it also opens things up too here now, Sayre, because now Darren Mougey, who obviously, the Broncos have had relationships with the Jets, even though the Sean Payton had those comments about Nathaniel Hackett, it didn't prohibit them from trading for John Franklin Myers last year in the NFL draft, one of the biggest steal moves of the entire offseason there. But now the lines of communication are open. And look, I think a lot of Broncos fans are really campaigning for Garrett Wilson, and they're putting social media polls out there where Garrett Wilson apparently, I don't know if it's photoshopped or not, but he's following a lot of Broncos players. He's interacting with some of the polls out there. I'm very, very interested to see what happens there, or if Mougey wants to keep a guy like that around, which I think you would want to keep a guy like Garrett Wilson around. The plan is going to be how are you going to address that quarterback situation there in New York. Certainly Aaron Rodgers is not the answer. We have a listener of Locked On Broncos. She listens every single day. Her husband is a Jets fan. He listens to Locked On Jets every single day, and so I'm sure that conversation is going to be very, very interesting as we continue to go about. But yeah, I mean, obviously happy for Darren, and one of the hardest working guys, very deserving of the job. But that's not the only departure the Broncos had from the organization over the weekend. During the AFC Championship game, it was announced that Declan Doyle, the Broncos tight end coach here for the past 2 seasons under Sean Payton, he is headed to Chicago under Ben Johnson to be the offensive coordinator by title. So, I mean, a good problem to have for the Broncos here, when your young coaches are getting poached off of your staff and going elsewhere. And with Aaron Glenn now landing in New York as well, I mean, the Broncos could have several other coaches, including Chris Banjo, maybe going over there to be the special teams coordinator. So Denver might be in the market here for some new coaches in 2025.
Not to mention Johnny Morton, Cody, getting looks from the Detroit Lions as their offensive coordinator. Of course, that would be a return to Detroit for him. Yeah. I think there's some sentiment out there that's really frustrating to me. Like, why are teams poaching from the Broncos after just one good year? Or I don't like the way of thinking of it like that. Like, most of these guys were on Sean's staff in New Orleans for a longer period of time where they had more sustained success. And so these are experienced coaches for the most part, but some of them are young and up and coming. I just don't think there's anything that you can say to overrate what the Broncos did last year with nearly $90 million in dead cap and the 3rd youngest roster in the league to kind of be saying like, wow, it's weird that teams are trying to pick off the staff after one good year. I don't like that thinking and mentality.
Good coaches everywhere.
There's good coaches everywhere, and I think these guys have earned it. So Declan Doyle, particularly interesting to me, Cody, as he won't be calling plays for the Chicago Bears. That will be Ben Johnson, the head coach, calling plays. But at the same time, it's a huge upgrade in title for him at the age of 28. And he's already part of the not only Sean Payton coaching tree, but also the Kirk Ferentz coaching tree, Cody. There was a controversy regarding Doyle's dad back in the day, strength and training coach at Iowa, but he was an offensive assistant for Kirk Ferentz there. His brother played for the Hawkeyes, and that was his first step before getting to the New Orleans Saints. So whatever the degrees of separation are in that situation is very interesting because you spent a couple years on Ferentz's staff at Iowa. You jump straight to Sean Payton's staff in New Orleans, and then you go straight to Denver's staff and now Chicago. So the ascent for Declan Doyle, who wasn't a player in college, is pretty fascinating to me.
Yeah, and look, so now I think it maybe opens up some opportunities. How can the Broncos address this in-house? Like if Johnny Moe ends up back in Detroit where he was the passing game coordinator for the Lions a few years ago, if he ends up there as their new OC, could we see maybe a promotion here for Davis Webb, getting a promotion not only maybe as QB coach, but maybe passing game coordinator, or he gets upgraded to passing game coordinator, and maybe a guy like Logan Kilgore, who was Arch Manning's coach, and worked with him, maybe he gets promoted to QB coach. And so you promote internally within, and now it raises the bar a little bit, right? And you're not looking to bring someone on the outside who doesn't have any familiarity necessarily with what you're doing. These guys have already been in your system. They know how Sean Payton likes things, but it's a promotion because they've done a tremendous job. Davis Webb has done a terrific job working in that Broncos QB room after transitioning from being a player to a coach. Chris Banjo from being a player to now a coach, from an assistant, for a couple of years, and now an opportunity for him to become a special teams coordinator, maybe in Denver, maybe elsewhere. But there is in-house moves that could be made here. And I think if you're like, for example, if you're looking to bring in someone from the outside, I think it raises the pressure for that person coming in and saying, wow, all right, I'm a new guy here. I've got to get with it because this whole staff knows the standard that Sean Payton has set. So, a lot of opportunities there. I don't know who they would try to promote from within at the tight end position. So we'll keep an eye on that, obviously, as things formulate and obviously as news happens, Broncos country, Locked On Broncos, Cody and Sayre, your boys, we're going to have you covered every single day here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every single day. We got a lot to break down still here on today's episode of the show as we're going to look at the tight end position. The Broncos tight end room in 2024 was not good enough, and we'll tell you why that can't be the case in 2025 here on today's episode of the show. Today's Locked On Broncos podcast is brought to you by our friends over there at LinkedIn. And as a small business owner, your work doesn't end when the clock hits 5. Your business is always on your mind, which means when it's time to hire, you need a partner that works just as hard as you do. And that's where LinkedIn Jobs comes in handy. When you clock out, LinkedIn, they clock in. And LinkedIn makes it easy to post your job for free. You can share it with your network, and you can get qualified candidates all in one place. Post your job. LinkedIn's new feature can help you write job descriptions and then quickly get your job in front of the right people with deep candidate insights. And here's a pro tip. Add the hashtag hiring frame to your profile picture to double your reach to qualified candidates. No wonder 72% of small businesses say LinkedIn helps them find high quality hires. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply.
The tight end position, as far as the passing game was concerned in 2024, mostly bad for the Denver Broncos. There won't be all that many changes in 2025, but we're going to get a new tight end coach and probably maybe potentially a new joker at the position in 2025. So an exciting offseason ahead for the Denver Broncos. But before we look ahead at what this team might do to change at this position, we got to look back at the season that was. Why are the Denver Broncos poised to be making a maybe big splash at the tight end position? Well, we're going to talk about that on today's episode, Locked On Broncos and Broncos Country. Thanks to all you everydayers out there that make us your first listen of the day every single day. Like Cody said, we got you every day throughout the offseason, whatever goes on with your favorite team here at Locked On Broncos. And if you're not already subscribed to the show, make sure you do that. Get us at the top of your podcast feed. You get us in your YouTube algorithm. You can watch the show or listen every single day. And I highly encourage you to do that because we want to be part of your day and we want you to be part of this show as well. There's going to be opportunities. Obviously, Cody will poll the listeners in terms of their thoughts overall as we get towards free agency, the tight end position. Who do all the listeners want to add to this room? Who do they think should be drafted? But before we get to that, we have to talk about this past season because I think we'd be remiss if we didn't mention Greg Dulcich. I didn't even have him in the show notes, but I think the lack of emergence for Greg Dulcich this year really contributed to the sort of, if you want to call it a disaster, that was at the tight end position. Now, it was disastrous from a passing game perspective. The Broncos got virtually nothing from their tight ends in the passing game other than a couple of spots here and there throughout the year. But what stood out to you the most about this position, or maybe we just get right into the player breakdowns? I'm fascinated your perspective on this because it's. I mean, when is the last time the Broncos had a great receiving tight end?
I think it goes back to, if I'm trying to jog my memory here, was there anything after the Peyton Manning years? I mean, Noah Fant had flashes, but it never formulated to where you wanted it to be because Pat Shurmur used him the wrong way, as we had seen. Owen Daniels might have been the last great Broncos receiving tight end. Maybe. And that's been a long time. That's almost 10 years ago, Sayre, since he's been on the team. So, I mean, when you look at it, it's disappointing to see what the tight end position has been for the Broncos, specifically in 2024. It was a complete letdown. And as you mentioned, I think it all starts and ends with Greg Dulcich because the expectations for him when Sean Payton first came in was, hey, he was going to be the Joker. He's got Joker traits to him. Well, first year of Sean Payton being here, he's never on the field. He got hurt week 1 and missed pretty much the entirety of the season with a hamstring injury, then had the foot injury pop up, had surgery on that. And then in training camp here this year, it's like, all right, like Greg Dulcich is, he's starting to look like his old self again. And nothing formulated early on. He just seemed like a decoy out there in the first several weeks of the regular season. and he couldn't block effectively enough, which was, I think, a huge issue in the eyes of Sean Payton. So the team, they released him, they moved on from him, and they put a lot of that once again on Adam Troutman. And look, I'll applaud Adam Troutman. He was the one guy who pretty much shouldered the load and the responsibility really of that room, because he had to block a lot. Like, the Broncos went 12 and 13 personnel quite a bit. And a lot of those guys did not get involved in the passing game. Troutman was pretty much the only tight end that had flashes of like being a pass catcher and having a couple of games. I think he had a 37-yard catch and run against the Chiefs at Arrowhead. He had a big game against the Atlanta Falcons, or was the Carolina Panthers. I think it was National Tight Ends Day whenever that did happen. And then all of a sudden it's just like, it was sporadic. It wasn't enough. And so for the Broncos offense, and particularly for rookie quarterback Bo Nix, you always say, like, having a good tight end is a nice security blanket option, right? When teams are doubling Cortland Sutton, and, you had all these questions about who's wide receiver 2 for Denver, how are you going to get these guys more involved? That's where a tight end can come in and help you. And look, once again, I'll take a look at, Jalen Hurts has a guy like Dallas Goedert. You look, Jaden Daniels had Zach Ertz, a veteran option there this season. Patrick Mahomes has Travis Kelce. Josh Allen, he's got Dalton Kincaid, but primarily it was more so like they didn't rely too much on Kincaid, this past week, obviously in the AFC Championship game. So, you look at it and it's like, good offenses, good teams, they have a good tight end. Denver didn't have that this year, and their production, I think, and the overall impact of that position kind of speaks volumes. So to answer your long-winded question, that's how I feel about the tight end room. It's obviously got to get better. Broncos Country is in agreement with it. But let's take a look at it. Like, the Broncos also have several roster moves that will come up with this. You mentioned this here in the notes. I mean, Sayre, like, Adam Troutman led the team at the tight end position with 188 yards receiving in 17 games. 188 and 17 from your primary tight end, right? And he didn't even lead the team in catches. That was Lucas Kroll, who had 19 catches on the season, but didn't even have 188 yards. So it's telling you that the tight end position in Denver's offense, it is not producing at a high enough rate in terms of yards and output. Like, Sayre, tell me your thoughts on this. If you have a tight end who's got 19 catches, you at least expect him to have more than 188 yards at that point, right?
Yeah, you got to have at least 200 probably at that point, right? I mean, if you're talking about roughly 10 or so yards per reception, I mean, I don't think that's over the moon expectations by any means. I don't know if it's the lack of opportunities at yards after the catch. I don't know if it's lack of weekly involvement just in general, Cody, but you're right. I mean, the biggest splashes in the passing game at the tight end position this year did come from Adam Troutman, who had that one-handed catch that you referenced against Carolina. And then I believe he had another touchdown. I think all 3 tight ends made plays against the Atlanta Falcons on National Tight Ends Day, and both Troutman and Adkins had touchdowns that day. But other than those plays, and they stand out because, I mean, it's easy to remember. It's like the last year we got the lunar eclipse as well. So it was like the lunar eclipse and the, or was it the solar eclipse, whichever one it was, one of the eclipses. And then we got the Broncos tight ends catching a couple of passes. So the rarity, what I'm saying is about on par for both. So I just think that when you look at this, is it a coaching situation? Is it an involvement in the offensive game plan? And I just think that they put too many eggs, as we've said on this show before, in the Greg Dulcich basket back in 2023. He supposedly had a tremendous OTAs under Sean Payton. The hype train was going off the rails. We remember these things because, man, Dulcich seemingly should have been the perfect sort of player at this position. But then at game against the New York Jets, where he missed a number of blocks and playing a big slot role, you just can't do that. That was the final straw for Greg Dulcich at the position. And so you hindered yourself. We never saw Donald Parham during the season. Lil Jordan Humphrey kind of did some cracking down blocking stuff as a big slot / filling in that Greg Dulcich role in a way. Yeah, I just think that it's just it was so disappointing to see the lack of effort put towards building this position, but also kind of just the lack of creativity in finding solutions. And that's really, to me, the biggest frustration about tight end right now. And that really hopefully will be the launching point for going forward in 2025.
Well, it has to be. I mean, for a quarterback like Bo Nix, for any QB in this league, I think to be successful, Sean Payton has said it. You have to have a strong run game and you have to have a defense, which Denver had a strong defense. They didn't have a strong run game in 2024. But I also believe you need a tight end that is capable of being an option for you, especially it doesn't even have to be like your primary guy on first down. Look, I don't think in today's NFL there are guys like Rob Gronkowski anymore, right? Like Rob was an all-around complete weapon. Look, there are guys who got big body types that could fit the board, like Sam Laporta, the Detroit Lions. Not a Gronk type guy, but can make a couple of Gronk type plays here and there, but it's not going to be at the volume rate in which we saw guys like Rob Gronkowski back in the day. Travis Kelce just a handful of years ago. Like even Kelce was relatively quiet in the AFC Championship game. You know, he has a couple of catches that moved the chains for a first down, but it's like those are big, those are huge. He doesn't have to be the 150-yard receiving guy anymore for that team. And so Denver needs to just find an option that can be someone that says, you know what, hey, my first read here, if you're Bo Nix, okay, Cortland's covered, Marvin's covered, I'm going to dump it off to the tight end, and we're at least going to get 5 to 6 yards at this point versus, okay, the tight end is not a guy who's necessarily respected by the defense in a pass coverage game, so we have to check it off to the running back instead and hope that you can get 4 or 5 yards. That's tough to do it at that position where you're throwing it behind the line of scrimmage. Find a guy that you can get 5 to 6 yards. Use a big body frame to box out smaller nickel defenders or safeties. And I like Denver's chances of being able to improve their offense here once again in 2025. But, man, it has to be an emphasis for Sean Payton and this coaching staff and for the front office here this offseason. Part of me believes that that is the case. But ultimately, when you look at after a lackluster year from the position, the Broncos, they could improve their outlook at tight end in 2025 by adding a legitimate pass-catching option here this offseason. We'll talk about that and more here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. Today's Locked On Broncos podcast is brought to you by our friends over there at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, and Super Bowl 59 is here. One game, two teams, endless possibilities, and there's no better way to make every play more exciting than with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Whether it's predicting the first touchdown of the game, calling the MVP, or betting on the coin toss, FanDuel makes it easy to get in on the action. With live betting all game long, you can adjust your bets as the game unfolds, and you can feel the thrill from kickoff to the final whistle. The live betting feature lets you stay involved no matter what happens on the field, and the app is super easy to navigate. Plus, knowing that you can place a $5 bet and potentially win $200 in bonus bets for the Super Bowl, that's the icing on the cake. So download the app or head to FanDuel.com to get started. Bet just $5, and if you win, you'll score $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com. Bet with FanDuel, official partner of Super Bowl 59. The fourth quarter action of today's episode, Locked On Broncos, is here. And if the offense and Bo Nix are going to take a step forward in 2025, they have to improve the tight end position. How do they do that? Free agency or the NFL draft? We'll break all that down here. Just want to say thanks once again to all the everydayers out there in Broncos country. Thanks for making us your first listen. We got you covered all offseason long. Once again, make sure you subscribe or follow wherever you get your podcast so you never miss out on what's going on with your favorite team. So let's ask this question here. And Broncos country, feel free to chime along as you're listening to the show or watching it. How do the Broncos fix the tight end position here in 2025? There are two avenues that are coming up that give the Broncos the opportunities to address this position, right? First off, NFL free agency. Is there somebody available on the free agency market that you can go out there and you can sign that's going to come in and make plays for you right away? Or the NFL draft, where there are a handful of young players who excelled at the college level this past season and throughout their collegiate careers that are now in line to be drafted in the NFL draft. Whether that's round 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7. The Broncos, they have options and they have opportunities. Just depends on how the board falls. Sayre, let's look at free agency first. First in-house here for the Broncos. What does that look like for them?
Right. Lucas Kroll is an exclusive rights free agent, which basically means like the price to bring him back is predetermined, and it's so low that you'd be shocked if he wasn't on the 90-man roster this offseason. Of course, we've got to mention Thomas Yasman, who was part of the international player program last year, who is on the 90-man roster as of March. He was signed to a futures contract by the Broncos, so he'll be back in the fold. But other than that, Adam Troutman under contract, Nate Adkins under contract. The Broncos have a number of guys that they'll be running it back with. The question, like you said, Cody, becomes who do we add to this position and where? I don't know that the Broncos can be overly picky about this. Free agency, the NFL draft, heck, let's even throw the trade market, whatever ends up materializing in that regard, into the mix, because you've got to leave no stone unturned in 2025 when it comes to upgrading the tight end position. 19 receptions by Lucas Krull leading the team. Pathetic. 188 receiving yards by Adam Trautman, as you mentioned. That led the team. That's pathetic. You've got to go add somebody and multiple somebodies at this position to improve just to raise the floor of the room. I mean, in general, you've got to get better pass catching options. And I think for Sean Payton and his staff, getting more creative about getting these pass catching options involved, especially when it comes to creating yards after the catch.
Yeah, I mean, that's so important. And look, we didn't see that very much here in 2025. And so look, I think internally, yes, I agree with you. I think you bring Lucas Krull back. Lucas is a player that I think is continuing to develop, and he's got great height, great size to him. I think he's a player that here in a year or two, I think he could be something special, Sayre. And I'm not going to walk back what I said last year about, hey, keep an eye on Lucas Krull. He could be a diamond in the rough. He could be an unspoken gem here on this Broncos team. Give him some time to develop, and he could be something that's complimentary, even if he's not the number one guy. But man, he could become a number two threat here at that position here for the Broncos in a year or two, and excited to see maybe the jump that he can take here. Obviously, we know that, from the fullback position, Michael Burton set to be a free agent. You have Nate Adkins on your roster as a tight end. Is this the year that Nate Adkins moves to that fullback, that hybrid H-back option, and plays that fullback role in situations here? And that's where you allow new blood to come in at this tight end position and maybe get some run. The first thing that comes up, though, is NFL free agency. And some of the names we've already seen linked or discussed as options. You look at New Orleans Saints pipeline here. Cody Roark, the VP of player personnel, spent a lot of time there. Pete Carmichael understands this as well. You look at Juwan Johnson, who's set to be a free agent. Certainly, I think an option here for the Broncos at the tight end position. You look at the Carolina Panthers and Tommy Tremble. Do they want to keep him there in Carolina to help out with Bryce Young, who obviously had a tremendous turnaround to his season and his career really after that Broncos game? The Broncos game was kind of one where it's like, hey, okay, Bryce is making plays against this Denver defense. But then from that point, Bryce really kind of went a little crazy there. So maybe you keep that tight end position there. That leads us to the NFL draft, where I think every Broncos fan is excited because people are already doing mock drafts. So, folks, I know you love your mock drafts. I'm not going to do mock drafts till after wave 2 of free agency, because then we can see where this team is at in terms of needs and flexibility here. But, man, it's hard to ignore the idea of when you look at Penn State tight end, you take a look at the production there. That obviously he had Tyler Warren. You look at even like Texas has a very underrated tight end in Gunnar Helm that I think is going to be a very interesting option here. And then there's Colston Loveland of Michigan. Like, this tight end class, a lot of people are saying is pretty good. And there's even some rumblings coming out of the Shrine Bowl. Who's the Iowa? You're an Iowa guy. I haven't watched
Luke Lachey.
Okay, yeah. He's making some noise at the Shrine practice in terms of that. Not necessarily fast, but good route runner, good size. I mean, even there, like in the Senior Bowl's coming up. So there's so much going on right now with some of these prospects that I think it'll allow us to have some more information to, as these practices go on, the Senior Bowl, the Shrine game happens. We're going to be able to see some of these underrated gems a little bit in action before they test at the NFL Combine.
Yeah, and here's the thing that I would warn to Broncos country, okay? Brock Bowers obviously is going to elevate the stock. Yeah, exactly. That's exactly my point. He's going to elevate the stock of guys like Tyler Warren, of Colston Loveland, but those guys are not Brock Bowers, okay? Don't assume that one of those guys is going to immediately come into the NFL and set the rookie tight end record for receptions and receiving yards and all these sorts of things. Like, those guys are not Brock Bowers. Like, Brock Bowers was Timothy James Jr. at Georgia. He was that dude, and a rare unicorn type of player who everybody could see, like, this guy's going to be something special. Not that these guys won't be good tight ends, but it would be such an unfair expectation to heap that upon any of them to say this guy could be the next Brock Bowers. I think to say, could they be the, quote unquote Brock Bowers for the Denver offense, in terms of moving around the offensive formation and being a go-to threat? Absolutely. That's fair. But here would be my top warning. Other than that, don't get married to the idea of any individual one of these guys, because it is such a deep draft class at the position. And I don't think that you can go wrong. Let's say you're round one, Tyler Warren or Colston Loveland. Round two, maybe it's Harold Fannin Jr., the guy who set the NCAA FBS record for receptions by a tight end this past year at Bowling Green. And then you've got, obviously, like you mentioned, Gunnar Helm, who's a Colorado native. And then everybody else in between. We're going to see guys at the Shrine Bowl. We'll see guys at the Senior Bowl, the NFL Scouting Combine. Broncos will look at guys at pro days. And I think in terms of the pre-draft, because you make a great point, Cody, in terms of the mock drafting stuff, we won't know until we get to the second wave of free agency. I could see the Broncos. I mean, is Taysom Hill going to be sticking around New Orleans? I don't know if he's not. I think he could come to Denver, and that would be a 1-year type move, but I feel like he would be an obvious candidate to come in. The Broncos really liked Luke Musgrave in the draft, and Tucker Kraft has emerged for the Packers. Do you see what the Packers would take for the final 2 years of Luke Musgrave's contract as a rookie deal there? So there's so many options. You can't leave any stone unturned if you're the Denver Broncos in 2025.
No, I'm excited about it too. And even like a little underrated gem like Ferguson from Oregon, who obviously played with Bo Nix. I mean, look, I don't think he's going to be a round 1, 2, or 3 guy, but might be a surprise guy you take a flyer on late. I don't know if he's going to get drafted, but man, he's developed a really great relationship there with Bo at Oregon. Could be a gem there. Even Broncos players. I talked to Troy Franklin, and he's like, man, he's a dog. I talked to Alex Forsythe. They're like, Ferg is a dog. Like, Ferg blocks. He can catch. He is a little bit of a weapon here. So he's obviously not going to be, I think, the Broncos' top priority, but a name to obviously watch in the NFL draft. And look, this is exciting because we can play all these what ifs, create all these scenarios here. I think we know what the Broncos need to do. We just don't know how they're going to do it and who they're going to bring in to obviously improve this position here. But that's why we discuss this every day. We look at every position. We look at the offense. We look at the defense. Every stone gets turned here on Locked On Broncos. And so thank you to all the everydayers, first listeners out there in Broncos country. That'll wrap up today's episode of the show. The plan for tomorrow's show, for all you everydayers out there, here's what you can expect on tomorrow's episode of the show. We're going to take a look at the Broncos offensive line at the tackle position. We know Garrett Bowles is locked into a long-term contract extension. Mike McGlinchey is continuing to burn off another year on his, but do the Broncos have some potential offensive tackles and waiting behind those guys? We'll take a look at the state of that on tomorrow's episode of Locked On Broncos.